From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And coming up today, K-State's Alex Shanoyan will report on a new analysis of farm operation diversification, how it relates to the farm's financial resilience during difficult economic times. This will be covered in one of the breakout sessions at the Risk and Profit Conference this week at K-State. Also today, from the IGP Institute at K-State, Jay O'Neill will tell of a special risk management workshop that the Institute is putting on for foreign and domestic grain buyers, the aim being to help those buyers handle price risk when purchasing U.S. grains. And later on, K-State's Charlie Lee will talk about how to positively identify blue-green algae on farm ponds. All this and more here on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever wondered why livestock producers burn Kansas pasture? Here's the deal. Controlled burning helps preserve the prairie and allows every bite feeder cattle eat to be the most nutritious. National Wildlife and Parks also feel it is a necessity to help with wildlife populations.
So the next time you see a Kansas pasture burning, know it's for the good of our wildlife, our prairie, and our livestock. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
We're glad to have you aboard for this Agriculture Today. Once more, we're going to pick up on a topic that will be covered in full a couple of days from now at that annual Risk and Profit Conference hosted by the Agricultural Economics Department here at Kansas State University. This particular session will look at new research into farm diversification and how that relates to the economic resilience of Kansas farms. We'll outline that further with our guest who will be presenting this along with his graduate student. Alex Shanoyan is an agricultural economist at Kansas State University. When you look at this question of economic resilience, Alex, what are you getting at here?
When we think about resilience, or when we just think about risk management, there's a lot of risk present in production ag. And our motivation for this particular project stemmed from, how can we help ag producers to mitigate some of the negative consequences of some of the risks or events or disruptions that are very difficult to predict but have important implications for farm production. Over the time, we have developed a lot of risk management tools that help us manage some of that risk. But there are some events that are very hard to predict, and things that we cannot predict is really hard to manage and prepare for. Then we started thinking about this, and we said, okay, what are some of the frameworks and approaches are out there to deal with this? And we came across this resilience approach in business and supply chain and also in biology and in some other fields that really talks about systems or entities or organizations' ability to withstand a shock or disruption and recover from it. So when we talk about resilience, we talk about the ability of an organization to experience the shock, be it economic shock or agroecological, so weather-related shocks, the extent to which the operations get affected by it, and also how long it takes for them to recover back to the normal level of operation, pre-shock level, or even better or improved level of operations after the shock. So that ability to recover is what we refer to as the resilience of a system or an organization.
And specifically, you wanted to look at the idea of diversifying a farming operation and how well that allows an operation to develop resilience and bounce back, so to speak.
Yes. So when we were looking at this, we said, okay, so we have shocks over time. Mm-hmm. Some farms are able to recover faster, or they essentially suffer less disruption in their operations than others. And according to the way we define the resilience, it means that some farms are more resilient to the shocks than others. So then the next question we ask is, what makes these farms more resilient than others? Obviously, there can be many different characteristics, many different factors that make them more resilient. But then we say, okay, we have to start from somewhere. In the risk management literature, the notion of diversification and its effect on mitigating risks is covered a lot. So we said, okay, we wonder if the diversification or extent of diversification can also make a farm more or less resilient.
Well, let's then visit about how you went about determining this. And you actually did utilize information from, several hundred farms, did you not?
Yes. Here at K-State, we're fortunate to have access to Kansas Farm Management Association database, which is a very detailed database about farm production and financial performance of Kansas producers. So we use that database to track the performance of farms over time. And specifically, we looked at instances of shocks.
You might define what you mean by economic shocks.
Yes. So, and again, those can be economic or agroecological shocks. So, for example, I'm probably too young to have experienced this firsthand, but I know in 1978 or early 80s, there was a big economic shock, and farmers in U.S. and in Kansas have experienced some downturns. That was one period that we looked at. More recently, we had some shocks associated with global economic crisis, shocks associated with changes in prices of energy, shocks associated with drought. I remember in 2012, we had a very strong drought here in Kansas, and a lot of farms had to struggle to recover from those shocks. So those are examples of shocks that we looked at, and really what we were trying to do is to see how the farms were able to withstand the shocks and how long it took them to recover from it using the data that is available at KFMA database.
And cutting right to it then, were you able to establish a link between the extent of diversity on one's farm and the ability to recover from these shocks?
Well, it wasn't as easy of a proposition as it might sound, because first we had to essentially find out a way to measure the resilience, the level of resilience, right? And for that, we used some methodologies that have been used in other disciplines, in business and in some other areas, to put it in a very concise manner. We're looking at two components: how hard the farm is hit by the shock, essentially how hard their performance is being affected, and then how long it takes them to get back to their normal recovery. So if we use those measures together, those measures can give us an index that we can use to measure the farm resilience.
You call that a resilience index.
Exactly. And then we had to come up with a good way to measure the level of diversification. And for that, again, we used some existing methods and approaches, and we came up with three measures of diversification. One, we looked at essentially the acreage allocation for different crops. And the second one, we looked at the sources of revenue, so the percentage of revenue from different crops. And the third, we looked at essentially what we refer to as a vertical diversification, or the operations that involve crop production and livestock operations. So those are three different ways we try to capture the diversification. Now, all of them have their own limitations, but that's what we went with. So then we tried to essentially look at how that diversification index can affect the resilience index, and we looked at the interaction. And the results, the preliminary results that we have right now, shows several interesting things. One of them is that the resilience of Kansas farms, and again, we're looking at only Kansas farms, that's the data that we have right now, have improved over time. So because we have the data from 1973 all the way to 2014, and there are several shocks that have occurred during that time period, our data shows that the resilience index of individual farms and also the just collective resilience index, Kansas, have been going up over time. So farms are adapting to shocks and becoming more resilient as they experience shocks over time. The other insight that we gained from this analysis is that the resilience of farms varies across regions in Kansas. In some regions, farms are more resilient than in some other regions. Now, our next step is to look at the resilience to specific type of shock, because we expect some farms to be more resilient to, let's say, weather shocks and other farms to be more resilient to economic shocks, depending on type of operations, the geographic locations, etc. But maybe some other factors that can affect that resilience as well.
So when you boil it all down, can it be said that greater diversity leads to greater resilience, or can it be simplified that way?
Well, it's not as black and white, but using some measures that we have, so for example, the percentage of revenue from different sources, for example, the presence of crop and livestock operations shows that there is a significant effect, although it's small but significant effect on resilience. Our next step is to take our preliminary results and to really talk to producers and identify some places where we can fine-tune our approach, our analysis to be able to really tease out that relationship between the diversification and resilience.
And that conversation, actually, you're hoping begins with this session at Risk and Profit Conference coming up later this week.
Exactly. We're very excited to be able to present these findings in front of Kansas ag producers, many of whom are actually a part of this database that we have been looking at. So it will be really interesting to get their thoughts and their insights on what we have found and to really test our results with actual people who will be using some of the findings or who will be benefiting from the findings of this project.
Yet another reason to attend the conference. Thank you for giving us a quick look at what you've come up with to date, Alex.
Thank you, Eric, for an opportunity to share our research.
He is Alex Shanoyan. He and graduate student Michael Lindblom have developed this mechanism to gauge farm diversification as it relates to resilience economically of Kansas farms using Kansas Farm Management Association data. Alex is an agricultural economist here at K-State, and we would remind one more time, if you haven't registered for Risk and Profit Conference here at K-State, you've still time to do so, but take care of that right away. Go to agmanager.info. Again, agmanager.info. There's a link to all of the particulars toward the top right-hand side of that page. We'll be back after you hear this over the K-State Radio Network. This is Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Coming your way now on this Agriculture Today, our regular update on the activities of the IGP Institute in the Grain Science and Industry Department here at Kansas State University. Along with us once again is the senior economist with the Institute staff, Jay O'Neill. Jay, we're right in the midst of actually a pair of workshops that you're conducting, short courses, if you will. This is a bit of a different bent from some of the other things that IGP Institute takes on. That is risk management, and this is for grain buyers. You might explain the intent of this pair of sessions.
Well, you're right, Eric. It doesn't have anything to do with the grain processing side of things. This short course is focusing on international and some domestic grain buyers and trying to help them understand how to use futures and options in a risk management strategy so that they can hopefully manage their price risk in the market, the risk of the market going up or down. In this case, mostly up if you're an end user around the world, and help them understand how to make U.S. grains more affordable.
This is an introductory course then, or a pair of courses?
We will do, and we are doing 3 days of an introductory basic lesson to bring them up to speed on the basic use of futures. And then we transition on Thursday and Friday of the week into options trading and how to advance from simple futures hedging to using options in your price risk management strategies.
So who is here from what countries as well as the domestic audience?
We have a domestic ethanol producer from up north in South Dakota joining us, a export trading company from Overland Park, Kansas has joined us in this group, and then we have a buyers group from Costa Rica, Syngenta from Brazil, who's trying to help understand price risk management with seed sales and seed production down in Brazil, actually. Bulgaria Farmer, Nippon Flour Mills is here, and AgriCorp out of Venezuela is here. So it gives us a pretty good cross-section of both a farmer, producer, end users, and then traders.
Do you find that these individuals have some rudimentary idea of risk management, or they're coming in totally cold, Jay?
Well, they're all engaged in the process of buying and selling grain in one form or another, so they have a rudimentary understanding. A few of them have done this for a couple of years, and they want to improve their knowledge and their skills. And a few others say, no, we're just beginning to get in it. One gentleman said, I've been doing this now for 1 year. I've been the grain buyer at an ethanol plant for 1 year, and I really need to understand this better. So it's a cross-section of different levels of knowledge, and we're trying to bring them all up to a common level.
And that common level gets really deeply into the intricacies of risk management and how futures and options and other risk management tools can operate for them.
Absolutely, and that's why we spend 3 days kind of prepping them for this, going through the basics and a good rudimentary, a good general knowledge of futures, because you have to understand futures before you even talk about options. But Thursday and Friday, we're going to get into the more detailed, more technical aspects of options trading. And then Friday, we're going to do a grain game, a practice game of using options and futures in actually, now that you've learned the things that you have learned over the last 4 days, now let's go through a practice game and actually put them to use.
What do you see as you work with this group, and you've worked with similar groups in the past, Jay, as the steepest part of the learning curve, so to say? What's the most challenging aspect of these markets and risk management as a whole?
I think the most challenging aspect with the diverse groups of individuals that we get in these short courses is grain traders. The sophisticated international grain trading companies, of course, understand very well how trading works and particularly how basis works. But if you get an end user, a producer, and a lot of end users, both domestically and particularly internationally, as this group has told me, it's, well, we hear the exporter, the person selling us the corn, the wheat, the soybeans, talking about basis levels, but we really don't know how that relates to us or what that means. So we try to walk them through that.
These are similar interests that farmers have out there, quite frankly, Jay.
Very, very, very much so. Farmers just know, hey, I'm getting a low, terrible-looking basis, but I don't understand why. And that's what we're explaining here in this course.
So as you look at the overall mission of IGP Institute, the importance of this kind of session as part of the mix, how do you view that?
Well, I think it is a mix, and it all does come together because IGP's mission is to help international buyers understand U.S. grain quality, U.S. grain standards, understand how to process U.S. grains, whether it be into flour or feed, how to store U.S. grains. But you look at all that and you have to say, well, they have to buy it in order to process it. So we're trying to help them understand how to buy it, how to price it, and how to be competitive in the market to keep them as healthy buyers, healthy customers of our grain.
And so far it's been a responsive group, and all of this well received on their part?
We've had a very good give and take, a lot of questions. It's always encouraging and interesting when they go home at night and they come back the next morning and say, well, now, wait a minute, we listened to you yesterday, but we have a few more questions to clarify some things. We did that this morning for probably a half an hour, but it's useful. It's very helpful, and it proves they're thinking about it.
Well, this is coming to a close at the end of this week once again. Consecutive sessions on risk management, 2 short courses, basic and advanced, and several domestic and international individuals in to take this in. Jay, in addition to all of this, we might note as well, IGP Institute has played host to a couple of international visiting entities this past week, one from Australia, one from Brazil. A group of Australian producers, you say, swung through. What was the story there?
Yeah, the group of Australian grain farmers, wheat farmers in particular, swing through usually each year about this time of the year. They came through while we were conducting our risk management short course, and they're interested in what we're doing in our farming and our agriculture in the United States and how our production economics look. So we were able, in this case, Sean was able to talk to them for a few hours and host them, talk to them about U.S. crops, and also talk to them about Australian crops. Interesting to note, they think USDA is overestimating the Australian wheat crop, and instead of 23.5 million tons. Now they're producers, so they're always a little bit on the cautious side, but they thought it was closer to 22 million. But we had a good give and take, a good exchange with the Australians yesterday while they were in our office. Always happy to host them and visit with them. And then we have a large Brazilian wheat miller, a gentleman who owns 4 wheat mills in Brazil, 2 in Sao Paulo and 2 in the north. And he came up here specifically because he knows he's going to have to buy some Argentinian soft wheat, but he also knows in doing that he's going to have to buy some good quality, good protein U.S., Kansas hard red winter wheat. So he came up, asked me to put together a visit schedule, an agenda for him where he could visit Kansas wheat, the government USDA lab here in town, Becky Miller's lab here on campus at the university, and then talk with Sean Thiele about what is the milling quality, what are the milling characteristics of this year's hard red winter wheat in Kansas, because he's looking to buy that for blending purposes to improve the mix that he's going to have down in Brazil.
So it's that kind of interaction, even if it's somewhat individualized, that's highly important in continuing the story about quantity and quality of Kansas-grown grains.
Absolutely. So in addition to those short courses that we do that may be a week long or longer, we do get these visits that come in and last one day or half a day, whatever the case may be, and we have that important interaction with our grain buyers.
But the IGP schedule does not rest. Jay, after this is over, this very weekend, you're headed to another event. This is in Omaha, a soybean trade expo. What's that about?
Yes, I'll get in the car and drive up to Omaha, Nebraska to the USEC, the United Soy Export Council's Soy Expo program that they're conducting in Omaha, Nebraska. And this is an annual program where they bring international trade teams, the buyers of U.S. grains from all over the world. There are trade teams from Asia, Southeast Asia, South America, North Africa, all over the globe. And they also bring together U.S. exporters at that trade show and expo and have a series of one-on-one discussions between the exporters and the importers and get the importers to introduced to the exporters. It's a very, very good, I think, very beneficial program, expo for both, where you don't just have a trade booth, but there's a lot of interaction with these trade groups. So we'll be going up. IGP will have a booth there, and we'll be interacting with the exporters and, again, with the grain buyers, hopefully helping them understand how to buy U.S. grain and what IGP has to offer to them and their companies that they might avail themselves of in the future.
That ought to be a great venue for displaying and showcasing what IGP Institute has to offer in support of grain exports out of this country to buyers around the world, and yet one more iteration of things going on this past week. Looking forward to visiting with you again and seeing what else is coming down the pipe as far as IGP activities in the very near future. Jay, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
He is Jay O'Neill, the senior economist on the staff of the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University. And regularly we bring you quick briefings on what that institute is up to in promoting U.S. grain sales abroad. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. We will stand aside for a few moments now. When we come back, today's agricultural news headlines. That'll include the updated Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report, just out from the USDA. K-State's Mike Brouk is awaiting with this week's edition of Milk Lines, and K-State's Charlie Lee is in the queue for his weekly visit on wildlife management. All that still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network. Please stay with us.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Welcome back. Well, the latest on Kansas crop progress and conditions now from the USDA posted yesterday. And for the week ending this past Sunday, the topsoil moisture ratings in the state at 8% surplus and 59% adequate, 33% short to very short. Subsoil moisture at 2% surplus, 68% adequate, and 30% short to very short. The condition of the corn crop in Kansas this week is rated at 55% good to excellent, 30% fair, and 15% poor to very poor. Corn silking now at 96%, that's right on the average. Corn in the dough stage, 70%, that's very near average as well. In the dent at 24%, that's behind the 29% average for this date. Soybean crop conditions then at 52% good to excellent, 38% fair, and 10% poor to very poor. Soybeans now blooming, 90%, that's ahead of the 85% average, and beans setting pods at 66%, that's fairly well ahead of the 53% average. The state of the grain sorghum crop in Kansas is 60% good to excellent, 32% fair, and 8% poor to very poor. Sorghum headed now at 65%, that's near average, and sorghum coloring is at 3%, that's behind the 10% average for the date. Third cutting off alpha is 86% complete, ahead of the 71% average, and fourth cutting is at 14%. Range and pasture conditions, 57% good to excellent, 32% fair, 11% poor to very poor, and stock water supplies at 1% surplus and 87% adequate, 12% short to very short. As far as nationally, slight improvements in the corn crop condition, according to the USDA. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says there has been an overall improvement in corn condition the week ending August 13th.
That crop is now rated 62% good to excellent. That's up 2 points from a week ago. And 12% very poor to poor, that is down a point.
At the same time, he says this year's ratings have not caught up to last year's.
At this time, we were 74% good to excellent and 7% very poor to poor.
Meanwhile, due to favorable weather, he says Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota all have seen decreases in the amount of corn rated very poor to poor.
These late rains and cooler weather are helping the corn crop in the Western Corn Belt.
51% of the corn has reached the dough stage nationwide, while 16% is dented. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And soybean progress nationally slightly ahead of normal, 94% of beans blooming as of this past Sunday. That's ahead of the average of 93%. 79% of the beans setting pods, above the 5-year average of 75%. And the national soybean condition falling slightly from 60% good to excellent the previous week down to 59% good to excellent this past week, according to the USDA. Want to remind you beef cattle producers about the first of those 3 Kansas Livestock Association K-State Ranch Management Field Days set for this coming Thursday the 17th. This will take place at the Black Diamond Angus Ranch near Spearville in southwest Kansas, starting at 3:30 with registration, the program at 4 o'clock, dinner to be served at 6:45. Among the topics to be covered there, will annual forage crops work with dryland farming in the High Plains? K-State's John Holman with that. Do high-protein forages negatively impact fertility? That covered by K-State's Sandy Johnson. Also look at opportunities for enhancing stock water and grassland health. From the NRCS, Brad Shank will address that. And out of Oklahoma State University, Justin Talley will take a look at the latest on fly and tick control for beef cattle operations. Again, that's the first of the 3 ranch management field days hosted by K-State and the KLA. This Thursday the 17th at the Black Diamond Angus Ranch near Spearville. To note, there are the 2 others on the agenda as well. The Ranch Management Field Day to take place in north central Kansas a week from today, the 22nd, at the Mark Diederich Family Farms. That's near Greenleaf. And the third of the 3 will take place a week from tomorrow, August the 23rd, at DL Cattle Company near Fredonia in southeast Kansas. For full information on these programs, go to kla.org, kla.org. Coming your way now, this week's edition of Milk Lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning the possibility of nitrates in corn silage and other silage crops we might be harvesting this fall. In many of the regions of our state, we did have some drought issues this summer, so if we used a lot of nitrogen fertilizer on our corn or sorghum crop, we may experience some higher levels of nitrates in forage that we might harvest off of those drought-stricken acres. One of the concerns I have is we've had some recent rain, and sometimes right after a rain for about the next 7 days, we see higher levels of nitrates in those crops. So if you've gotten some rain on some of your drought-stricken crop and you're considering harvesting it for silage or for forage for your animals, you might want to take that into consideration. Again, generally if we wait about 7 days, those levels tend to drop down and it's not much of a problem. However, testing is really the only way to know whether or not you have a problem. Keep in mind that if you harvest that crop as a hay crop, you probably will not see much of a reduction in the nitrate level from harvest until you actually feed it. However, if you harvest it and preserve it as a silage crop, generally we see those levels drop. Oftentimes maybe as much as 50%, but that's not necessarily a guarantee. So it's always good to test maybe while you're chopping as well as after the crop has been ensiled. Keep in mind that generally we think about nitrate issues with things like corn and sorghum and maybe some sorghum sedan grasses. However, we have found nitrates in recent years in things like soybeans, so you can find it in other crops as well. Another consideration if you are chopping the crop for silage is to high cut it. Most of the nitrates will actually be located in the lower 12 to 18 inches of the stalk. So cutting a bit higher will probably miss many of the nitrates that might be located in the lower part of the stalk. Also, if you're going to test a crop prior to chopping to determine whether or not you may have a nitrate problem, always best just to test the lower 12 to 18 inches of the stalk rather than the whole stalk. If you don't have any problems in the lower 12 to 18 inches of the stalk, probably the rest of the crop will be just fine, as the nitrates are generally higher in the lower part of the stalk. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to think about nitrate levels as they harvest forages this fall.
Thanks, Mike, as always. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll be back in a few moments with K-State's Charlie Lee on another aspect of wildlife management here on the K-State Radio Network.
This is Man, it's hot out here. Heat stress affects more than just humans. It also affects livestock. Extreme heat, humidity, wind speeds, and cloud cover all make a difference in air temperature. To control problems, make sure your livestock have shade and water provided at all times. This will help prevent problems in breeding, meat production, and reduce chances of death. Please take all these into consideration for livestock production. Brought to you by K-State Animal Science Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now. Once again, Mike's side is wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. And Charlie, you're providing an alert today to farm pond operators, others with water impoundments on their property, about the development of blue-green algae. This has become almost an annual summertime threat here and there, has it not?
Yes, it certainly peaks this time of year. We can have blue-green algae blooms at numerous times, but from mid-June to late September is when we see the majority of the blue-green algae blooms. Blue-green algae is also known as cyanobacteria. They're a group of photosynthetic bacteria that many people refer to as pond scum. But others contend, since the cell utilizes the sunlight for photosynthesis, that it's a plant, and thus it should be blue-green algae. And others maintain that since the cell doesn't have a very well-defined nucleus, it's a bacteria or a cyanobacteria. So I guess we're still not sure exactly what the terminology should be, and it's very difficult to physically describe blue-green algae. They come in lots of different colors. It can be blue-green, but it can also be dark blue, green, reddish purple, or even brown. They grow in lakes and ponds, occasionally in slow, somewhat stagnant streams, typically when the water gets warm and where we have water that's fairly nutrient rich. So we have a lot of different species of blue-green algae that occur in Kansas waters, but one of them that's the most commonly detected is microcystis, and that's one that can produce toxin, hepatotoxin. It's not always the same species that blooms in a given water body, and the dominant species that's in that pond can change over time.
And that toxin, again, can pose a health threat to whatever's consuming that water, including livestock and potentially wildlife?
Yeah, there are a lot of concerns associated with blue-green algae, and that could include just discolored water, reduced penetration of light through the pond. If you're using that pond for drinking water source, there's some taste and odor problems associated with it. There's changes often in the flavor of fish that are consumed from a pond that has blue-green algae. And then there are the health considerations for livestock that are drinking the pond or pets that may be playing in the pond.
What can be done if, in fact, there is a blue-green algae bloom in one's farm pond? Can one treat the pond in any way and counteract this condition?
Well, there's really no one quick and easy remedy for the control of blue-green algae in ponds. Once they occur, it's very difficult to deal with them. Keep in mind that the best way is to try to reduce the nutrients that wash into the pond, and that's going to reduce the frequency and the severity or the intensity of these blue-green algae blooms. I think it's important for people to realize the importance of improving and maintaining water quality, and perhaps we're seeing some of these problems that are occurring currently because we didn't take steps to address water quality issues a long time ago.
Some have said something on the order of copper treatments might at least diffuse blue-green algae.
Well, copper treatments certainly can provide a temporary solution to kill blue-green algae, but the treatment doesn't deal with the root problems of what causes that algae to grow to begin with. Another very important concern is that when you treat blue-green algae with copper sulfate and the cyanobacteria dies, the toxins are then released en masse in a very short period of time, and they settle and disperse throughout the entire water body. So just because you don't have live blue-green algae in the pond does not mean that you don't have the toxins present. So copper sulfate is very frequently used in ponds, but again, it's treating the symptom, it's not treating the cause.
Before anybody does anything about this, they need to be sure that this is, in fact, blue-green algae that they're seeing in their pond and not one of these other algae types. There is a handy test for that, you say.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's very important to distinguish between blue-green algae that's producing a harmful bloom and green algae, which are very important in the food chain in a pond. So the Kansas Department of Health and Environment have given some general guidance on what they call the jar test. It's not 100% perfect, but it is a simple method to try to determine if you do have blue-green algae. Keep in mind that in Kansas, the majority of the blue-green algae blooms are very buoyant, so they're floating up on the surface of the pond. So in order to conduct this very simple test, you take a clear 1-quart-sized glass jar, wearing rubber or latex gloves. You collect a sample of water from the pond. Try to avoid as much skin exposure as possible and collect the water sample just below the surface of the water. Fill your jar about 3/4 full. Put the lid on it. Wipe off any extra scum that may be on the outside of the jar, and then place the jar in the cold refrigerator and leave it completely undisturbed overnight. The next day, very carefully remove the jar from the refrigerator and look to see where the algae have accumulated. If you're careful in handling the jar, you're not going to agitate and mix up anything that may be floating on the surface. And since blue-green algae is the most buoyant, you're going to see a very clear layer of blue-green algae on the surface if you have blue-green algae present. If the jar stays somewhat even in coloration all the way through, you may have some blue-green algae throughout the water column, and it may be some green algae that's in there as well, the planktonic algae that is the good algae, if you will. And if the algae is settled completely to the bottom, then it's unlikely that you have blue-green algae present. It's not 100% accurate, but it's a fairly simple test to begin to determine whether you need to collect other samples and have it sent in to see whether the toxin is in the blue-green algae that may be occupying the surface of your pond.
It's been identified once again in water bodies, particularly farm ponds in Kansas this summer. Again, a buildup of blue-green algae, which can well be a toxic substance dangerous to many things. And Charlie, thanks for the heads up on this. Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee there. And that is our time for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.